Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. This time around, we're diving deep into Russia's diplomatic relationship with Africa. The continent, with 54 countries, over 1.4 billion people, and a rapidly growing collective economy, has apparently become Putin's new BFF. Last week, the Russian despot promised total support to Africa in a bid to outflank the West. Total support is something Putin's clearly not giving to his own people, who are busy raiding their piggy banks to buy a loaf of bread. But Africa, it seems, is getting the full Vlad treatment, promises, flattery, and more spin than a figure skater on the Kremlin's payroll. So, what's going on here then? Let's take a look at our report to find out more.
At the Russia-Africa summit in Sochi, in a speech read out by Moscow's foreign minister, Vladimir Putin pledged total support for Africa. The summit was a kind of capstone to Russia's latest efforts in wooing some of the continent's countries. And the latest deals, with 33 of them, cover a wide range of affairs, from combating terrorism and military agreements to even cultural exchanges. Russia has shown great confidence in these new partnerships.
In the past year, we reached a historical maximum of trade turnover of $24.5 billion. But it is clear that this figure does not reflect the potential that we have, which must be fully revealed.
Moscow has also shown awareness of the various internal struggles the continent has been facing. Its decision to snub the lead of the Polisario separatists from taking part in the summit in Sochi is a blow to the ruling Algerian junta. Other countries which have refused their participation in events involving African countries include China and the United States. Yet despite how it shows its latest diplomatic successes to the outside world, some observers are doubtful of whether they will be enough to make up for Russia's losses in the Western world.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. Why is Russia suddenly buttering up Africa like a desperate online data? Well, it's part of Putin's broader strategy to flip the narrative. He wants to present Russia as the heroic anti-colonial force that's ready to liberate Africa from Western domination. Because we all know, there ain't nothing as freedom adjacent quite like getting cozy with a man whose idea of diplomacy involves invading your neighbor and lying every chance you get, right? Putin himself is declaring Russia's unwavering support for Africa's development and sovereignty, which, coming from him, is a bit like Ronald McDonald promising to help you with your diet. It all sounds nice, but you really need to look at his track record. Remember the grain deal fiasco, for example? Russia pulled out of it, blocking Ukrainian grain exports, which in turn spiked food prices across Africa. So, while Putin is promising to save Africa from Western neo-colonialism, he's actually exacerbating food insecurity on the continent. African countries were left scrambling and millions faced hunger. But Putin sees an opportunity here. He's not just offering friendship, he's offering a counterweight to the West. And if there is one thing Putin loves, it's playing the underdog against those pesky Americans and Europeans. In Putin's fantasy land, Africa is part of a grand alliance against Western dominance. Geopolitical Avengers, if you will. There's just one problem. African leaders aren't exactly eager to be his sidekicks. Many African countries have taken a neutral stance on the Ukraine war, choosing not to alienate either side. But that hasn't stopped Russia from doubling down on its anti-imperial messaging. Russian state media has been flooding Africa with messages of solidarity, presenting the West as the new colonial oppressor and Russia as the brave liberator. It is a narrative that resonates in regions scarred by decades of Western exploitation. But the irony is that Russia itself has a history of colonial practices as well. Just ask the people of Chechnya, Georgia, or, Ukraine. If there is one thing Putin knows well, it's how to spin a story while ignoring his own reflection in the mirror. And it's not just state propaganda either. Russian troll farms have ramped up disinformation campaigns across African social media platforms, promoting pro-Russian narratives and attacking the West. For Putin, it's all about optics, portraying himself as the champion of the global South, even if that means bending the truth more than an Olympic gymnast. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is Russia offering Africa in return for this so-called total support? The answer, predictably, is weapons, mercenaries, and a whole lot of empty promises. The Wagner Group has been active across the continent, offering security services to African regimes. Even despite Yevgeny Prigozhin's transformation into a firework last year, Putin's favorite gang of mercenaries continues to operate under a new name, by the way, Africa Corps. That's a very poor choice of words, I guess, but anyway, Russia. These guys also have left a trail of violence and instability from Libya to Mali. So when Putin promises support, he really means sending a bunch of heavily armed guys who solve problems, by creating bigger ones. So, is Putin really the savior of Africa? Probably not. He is more like a traveling salesman, peddling promises that are shinier than they are real. And African leaders, for the most part, seem to know that. In the end, Russia's African gambit is a desperate attempt to find new allies as old ones continue slipping away. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Tara O'Connor, Managing Director at Africa Risk Consulting. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So let's begin with Putin's overarching goals in Africa. They're all based upon the assumption that Russia is supposed to be this country that, it has never committed the mistakes of Western powers. It was never a colonial power itself, and so it can support African countries in their drive towards self-determination. Now, the obvious question, can you see any problems with that narrative?
Well, yes, I can. As someone who grew up in a country, Zambia, which was under the Soviet bloc influence during the Cold War, that narrative is absolutely not a right one. And under the Soviet influence, we lived in a country that had very few, even food on the shelves and so on. But it's also currently not necessarily true. The current Russian influence in Africa has not been a great success. What we have seen is that at the very first ministerial conference, I think, or at an earlier ministerial conference, Putin promised to quadruple trade to Africa. This has not happened. And yet Russia has very much supported countries, for example, that have had military coups. In the Sahel, we have seen Russia actually being part of a destabilizing factor. 3 countries, Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, all underwent military coups in the last few years, and they ordered their Western allies, Western troops, some 20,000 troops, to quit the region, and they were due to be replaced by military support from Russia. And the limited military support that Russia has provided has actually opened up the whole Sahel to a much greater Islamist insurgency that has seen civilians, mass killings of civilians, and a greater level of insecurity and economic destruction across those 3 countries.
So these are unforeseen consequences, or perhaps not entirely so, for Russia goes into countries knowing that it may actually cause plenty of things to happen, plenty of things which will be perceived negatively by the population, but by that time they will have got what they wanted. Would you say that, despite the fact that Russia clearly is not really about empowerment, it is more about propping up dictators, taking away resources, that it still has managed to some extent to dominate the discourse, with people on the street often waving Russian flags and saying, you're asking us about colonizers. Colonizers were Western powers, France, Britain, not Russia. Do you think that this is because the discourse about colonialism in Africa is mostly about Africa itself? It's not like people, sit down and think, what about colonialism taking place on other continents? Would you say that this perhaps could be a factor?
Well, I think Really, there are a number of truths in that. The Russian narrative of Africa being dominated by the former colonial powers, fell on very willing ears, and that is largely because I think particularly France has maintained a very strong, until very recently, very strong political, military and economic ties with Africa. And in particular, France dominates a 14 countries in West Africa use the CFA franc, which is the Communauté Française Africaine currency, which is tied to the euro. So there are, definitely, and that has built up an awful lot of sense that African countries, even though it's almost 60 years since independence, still have not gained their independence from the West.
So there is resentment, right? And Russia is capitalizing on this.
And Russia has totally capitalized very easily on that. But now people are actually seeing that the reality of Russian involvement is, as you say, to prop up, the strategy is to actually go in, prop up the dictator, for example, in these three countries, and in other countries such as Equatorial Guinea, where Russian troops have just come to provide military support to the dictator there. And so we're actually seeing, first of all, they protect the man, then they find out, then they demand payment from the natural resources. And it's estimated that Russia's involvement in Mali is costing the Malian government something like $10 million a month. And that's an estimate, and no one can be certain of that figure. But that's what people are talking about in terms of paying for Russian military support.
So you mentioned Equatorial Guinea, and that's an interesting example because it used to be a country that was very much high, on the list of priorities of Western companies because of the oil reserves. But later on, these companies have turned away. Because, they have found domestic sources in the US, and so they thought, okay, so we don't really need this to such an extent as we used to. So now Russia is actually, once again, it's creeping into those cracks which are left by the West, acting in a very heavy-handed way, and filling the gaps, if you will. Do you think there is a risk that not only will Russia take away these resources, also it may try and basically mix its own oil with oil from Equatorial Guinea and sell it off as African oil, thereby basically skating around sanctions, as it has been doing already in many other ways. But I mean, when the sanctions are biting down, Russia is always trying to be, creative.
Yes, I would say I don't know about that oil. Certainly, oil in West Africa used to be, because it has the same quality as American oil. It was very much in demand until America became very self-sufficient in oil. And certainly Russia is using its relationships with Africa to avoid sanctions. At the moment, the most prominent area where Russia is avoiding sanctions is actually in participating or being complicit in smuggling of gold, in actually getting involved in gold mining and smuggling gold, mainly via the UAE, where it has strong relationships and where there is a very unregulated gold market. But definitely Russia is moving into areas which are particularly democratically vulnerable, like Equatorial Guinea, and exploiting countries that where democracies are rather weak, again with this strategy of either propping up an opponent to the regime, supporting them in their election campaign, supporting them with propaganda, and so on.
So what about the information sphere? Because that's also another sphere of influence that Russia is trying to actually get into. We know that, for example, Russia Today has been running programs for young journalists, well, training programs on the surface, but we do know that Russian narratives are going to be included in the package, as it was. Do you think that this can distort the information space permanently, given that, well, it's a space that is still developing, right? You know, the technologies are flowing in, but there is also lots of, you know, there are many risks of manipulation with people being less aware of the methods that bad actors, such as Russia, could be using.
So Russia Today, we do see Russia Today, but we also see Chinese and other international competing media looking to find their space in Africa. And certainly, for example, in Tanzania, you're starting to see posters for Russia Today there, and definitely Russia Today is becoming more prominent. But actually, the most important thing is actually via social media. You know, the social media, something like 700 million people across the African continent have access to phones and increasingly smartphones. And so people get their media via smartphones. So social media is a critically important component. But yes, we are seeing a greater presence of Russia Today. I should say that Russia is not alone here. And to look at this from the Africa perspective, you know, a lot of African countries are very aware of what Russia is doing and are not complicit necessarily in it, but are using this Russia interest, Turkish interest, interest from the Gulf states to diversify their partnerships and trading partners for their own benefit. And this is also in the context of the whole drive is in the context for a new scramble for Africa, where there's a lot of players, not just Russia, and the players that actually do bring development, and I will argue that Russia under its current regime does not bring sustainable development, increased trade or stability, but the countries that do will find long-term partnerships and great benefit in Africa's desire to diversify its trade away from its traditional partners or to have multi-partners.
Of course, as long as these countries will have also done their homework, i.e. that their influence is empowering and not exploitative. I mean, nobody wants any sort of, repeat offenders acting as if they were colonial powers. We are accusing Russia of doing this, and, there are many arguments for it. But then again, it's also important to remember that companies, whenever they find themselves in an environment they can exploit, well, they might actually try to do that just because they want to be driving profits up. So, again, it's probably important to remember this other side of the coin there. Tara O'Connor was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. And starting off with some gestures showing dictators like Lukashenko that they aren't as popular as they would like to believe. Polish President Andrzej Duda refused the COP29 group photo over the Belarusian leader's presence.
While these photos do not mean much in the long run, they do have a certain symbolic meaning to them. They are an opportunity for leaders to show the world that despite their many differences, they still, quite literally, stand together. Yet the presence of individuals like Alexander Lukashenko casts a shadow over the intended message, and Poland's president decided to abstain. It is not often that a leader refuses a group photo. Just a month ago, Duda eagerly hosted the Areolos summit and posed for a photo. A source close to Duda's delegation at the COP told Polish media that his decision was motivated by Belarus's involvement in the developments in Ukraine. This is not the first time that this has happened over Lukashenko's presence. Poland, Lithuania and Latvia's leaders also recently refused a group photo at a previous summit in Dubai.
Speaking of Alexander Lukashenko's friends and enemies, his buddies in Russia have been busy passing their latest controversial bill. This time, the Russian State Duma has passed a law banning what they refer to as child-free propaganda.
The MPs in Russia's lower chamber of parliament passed a bill unanimously. It prohibits the public dissemination of materials, such as films or other media, which would promote the alleged rejection of childbearing. The bill is meant to help combat Russia's serious problem with an aging population. The country has had very low birth rates for quite some time, and since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, also a high mortality rate. The new legislation involves hefty fines on individuals and organizations promoting child-free propaganda. Critics of the bill say it will do little to address Russia's demographic problems, and they warn that due to its vague language, it will be used to clamp down further on Russia's already frail freedom of expression.
Staying on the subject of Russia, Moldova's foreign ministry says it has handed a note of protest to Moscow's newly appointed ambassador to the country. The note concerns Russian interference in the recent elections and the downing of 2 Russian drones over Moldovan territory.
This year's elections in Moldova were a true nail-biter, and not just because of the close vote. Reports indicated rampant Russian interference in the elections, as Moscow did not want Moldova to continue on its pro-EU course. Moldova has accused Russia of using bribes, ineligible voting, and even security threats to sway the result of the vote. Despite Maya Sandu's re-election and the country saying yes to pro-EU constitutional changes, Moscow claims the vote was unfair and does not view Sandu as a legitimate president. Chisinau has also condemned the violation of its airspace by 2 Russian drones, which were found on Moldovan soil following a Russian drone strike against Ukraine.
Belarusian political prisoner Maria Kolesnikova has appeared in a photo with her father after contact with her was lost 21 months ago. Kolesnikova is one of over 1,000 political prisoners being held by the Lukashenko regime.
This is Maria Kolesnikova's sister, Tatiana, who has been campaigning for her release for years. She has been fearing for her sister's life ever since she was forbidden contact with the outside world. Kolesnikova is an important figure in Belarusian opposition politics, as she was one of the leaders of the 2020 protests against Alexander Lukashenko's regime. She was imprisoned after she had ripped up her passport, as Belarusian security services had tried to forcibly deport her. The circumstances around the photo remain unknown. It was first posted by Belarusian activist Roman Protasevich.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.